Okay. spot. We'll go into the
Subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Now that the VA has opted to provide witnesses, we are here today to resume our May 24th conversation about the competition and conflicts of interest of the VA contracts. We will be broadening our focus from IT contracts to consulting and professional services contracts. VA spends over $3 billion a year on management consulting contracts with companies ranging from the largest multinational consulting firms to boutique shops that rely on the VA for most of their business. Similar to the IT sector, the top 10 consulting firms receive about 40% of the VA's consulting dollars. These companies support nearly every function of the department, including contracting with other companies, and the VA is increasingly relying on them. I have no doubt that many of them operate ethically. But the ranks of government contracting have never been known to be filled with saints. Of all areas of contracting, consulting and professional services contracts are the most fraught with conflicts of interest. That is not my opinion. That's what the regulators and regulations say. When contractors are virtually indistinguishable from government employees and they are privy to the most information that passes through the agency, there's a lot of opportunity to exploit access to non-public information. Here are some examples. In March, the Wall Street Journal reported that McKinsey consulted for VA on internal management while advising its opioid manufacturer clients how to sell more pain pills to the department. That's problematic on so many levels. Let's not forget that happened during the height of the opioid epidemic that has shaken hundreds of thousands of lives and upended countless others. We've been getting complaints for years about how the VA's medical distributors substitute their own, usually more expensive products for those of VA's contracted suppliers. It also seems to be a standard practice for VA organizations to hold their off-site leadership meetings and planning retreats in contractors' facilities. Not only are key strategic decisions made with contractors present, they're made under the contractors' roofs. And we have seen time and time again how the same companies that staff the offices of VA decision makers tend to get contracts to perform projects for those other offices. Not to mention when former VA executives take jobs with companies whose contracts quickly multiply. The revolving door on Capitol Hill rightfully gets a great deal of scrutiny, but it is swinging out of control in federal agencies such as VA. So we're not just talking about the actual conflicts of interest, but statute also describes the perception of. We have to eliminate both. For all these reasons, Chairwoman Kiggins and I found it unbelievable when Secretary McDonough stated in a May 31st letter that no organizational conflicts of interest exist among VA contractors. That's just absurd. I want to let Ms. Kiggins describe her letter, but let me emphasize how implausible the VA's answer is. VA's position seemed to be that in more than $3 billion of consulting contracts annually, there's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. On the contrary, I intend to lay out the situations that are happening as we speak in the VA, as reported by concerned employees and other companies. I welcome our witnesses' explanations. This issue is crucial to the integrity of the VA as an organization and its ability to serve our veterans. A culture of cutting ethical corners creates a breeding ground for fraud. That is not hypothetical. Every month, we see indictments and convictions involving companies defrauding the VA, often paying kickbacks or bribes. These schemes are keeping U.S. attorneys all over America busy. I want to encourage every company that plays by the rules to keep doing the right thing, and I urge everyone who sees conduct that may be criminal to report it to the VA Office of Inspector General Hotline. Thank you. And with that, I will recognize Ranking Member Surface McCormick for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Technology Modernization Subcommittee. The Technology Modernization Subcommittee conducted extensive oversight of VA modernization and IT contracting last year. A common thread identified was a fundamental lack of planning, budgeting, and adherence to contracting best practices by VA and its contracting center. VA acquisition management has been on the GAO high-risk list since 2019. GAO has also cataloged issues with competition for IT contracts. While VA's annual IT obligations have increased from $42 billion in 2017 to $6.5 billion in 2021, the number of companies receiving those awards have decreased. A particular concern of mine is the management and oversight of the T4NG enterprise contract run by the Technology Acquisition Center. The vehicle, which is currently being recompleted, has historically been dominated by a few large companies. The vehicle supports a number of IT programs across the VA. I don't think I have to mention again the record of success the VA has had with IT. So it brings me into question how well VA is vetting and managing not only who is on the vehicle, but as those companies are evaluated. I realize that the VA is at a disadvantage when it comes to holding these large companies accountable and attempting to mitigate conflicts of interest. Regardless, we need to find ways to hold poor performers that continue to win work at the VA accountable. It's unacceptable that we continue to award companies over and over again that have not led successful programs at the VA. Hopefully, our hearing today will provide insight into their needs and resources that Congress can provide. Thank you again for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to our discussion this morning. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Surface McCormick. I now recognize Chairwoman Kiggins for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Rosendale. I'm glad you and I were able to bring our subcommittees together to collaborate on this important issue. Whether it's in corporate boardrooms, public agencies, law firms, or institutions throughout this country, conflict of interests are ignored at great peril. Conflicts of interest have given rise to countless scandals and ended many careers. I know everyone in this room takes this issue very seriously. From what I've seen in my 6 months on this committee, the Department of Veteran Affairs seems to have become complacent with its contractors' potential conflicts of interest. In 2021, the VA doled out over $38 billion to contractors. Every day, contractors are advising, analyzing, researching, drafting, and contributing to decisions at all levels of the department. Sometimes it appears the contractors are even making some of the department's decisions themselves. Today, a litany of consulting firms, healthcare suppliers, and other companies have spun the VA into a web of competing financial interests. VA's leaders appear surprisingly unconcerned about this situation and unmotivated to untangle the department. This has very real consequences. Every dollar that is wasted on a contracting boondoggle fails to reach the doctors, nurses, and other professionals who directly serve our veterans. It's no wonder why, even as the VA's budget continues to grow, the quality of services that veterans receive barely improves. Veterans and taxpayers deserve to know that decisions in the VA are being made in the public interest by VA employees, not outsourced to unaccountable contractors who may harbor conflicts of interest. In March, I sent a letter to Secretary McDonough asking him how many times a VA contracting officer identified, mitigated, or otherwise resolved a contractor's potential or actual conflict of interest in the last 2 fiscal years. I wanted to know what the VA is doing to make sure the companies are operating on an even playing field. The Secretary's response on May 31st was not believable. It was, as I quote, "The VA has no occasions where a contracting officer identified a potential or actual organizational, personal, or other conflict of interest in a solicitation or contract award for advisory and assistance services." Given everything we know about the size of the VA spending and what functions have been outsourced, this was implausible. This would be like a town talking all its police off the beat and the citizens believing there's no more crime because arrests stopped happening. As Chairman Rosendale described, the Wall Street Journal highlighted a very serious potential conflict of interest on the part of McKinsey. For several years, they were carrying out a wide range of consulting projects for the VA while simultaneously advising pharmaceutical companies how to target the VA to increase their opioid sales. Somehow, no one said a word about this until it was revealed years later. Secretary McDonough's response made it clear that the VA had no concern whatsoever about McKinsey's web of clients impacting its work for the department. I'm eager to hear the witnesses here today explain this attitude towards contracting with a company that paid $600 million settlement for their role in the opioid epidemic. McKinsey is not the only one. I've heard numerous complaints from employees and contractors about the VA's apparent disinterest in managing organizational conflicts of interest. I find the magnitude of the spending on consultants questionable, but worse than that, when conflicts of interest are allowed to fester, that money is lining pockets rather than supporting veterans. This is fundamentally unacceptable, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how we can clean this up. Thank you, Chairman Rosendale, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins. I now recognize Ranking Member Mervan for opening statement that he may have.
Thank you, Chairman. As the Chairman last Congress of Technology Modernization Subcommittee and as Ranking Member of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee this Congress, I have seen how large an impact contracting has on the VA. My staff has heard of competition and conflict of interest issues with acquisitions across the department. A major concern of mine is with the lack of oversight and controls of the medical surgical prime vendor contracts. MSPV is a collection of contract vehicles that enable VA to streamline supply chain management for an array of medical supplies. We have heard that large companies awarded contracts for distributing these supplies have historically been granted conflict of interest waivers. These waivers would allow a company to not only distribute supplies, but also sell their own supplies at the expense, and in place of service-disabled veterans-owned small businesses that have contracts to provide supplies for the VA. VA has assured our committee that these waivers are no longer a part of the MSPV contracts, but that has not remedied all the issues that veteran-owned small businesses are experiencing. We all know on this committee that the VA lacks a sophisticated and well-equipped acquisition structure and workforce committee members and workforce. Committee members all know that VA does not have the requisite employees to thoroughly oversee this huge vehicles. That does not absolve the acquisition leadership from doing better. The fox is in the henhouse when it comes to providing supplies across VA, and veteran small businesses are suffering. Today is an opportunity to voice to members of this committee your needs to ensure that competition is a priority of the department and what exactly is needed to remedy the issues of conflict of interest. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mervan. I will now introduce the witnesses on our first and only panel. First, we have Mr. Michael Parrish, VA Chief Acquisition Officer. He's accompanied by Mr. Philip Christie, the Deputy Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction, and Dr. Angela Billups, VA Senior Procurement Executive. We also have Mr. Joseph Maletta, the Veterans Health Administration Executive Director of Acquisitions. Finally, we have Ms. LaWanda Jones, Deputy Chief Information Officer for Strategic Sourcing. I ask the witnesses to please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you, and let the record reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Mr. Parrish, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement on behalf of the panel.
Good morning, Chairman Rosendale, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Surface McCormick, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the subcommittees. I'm pleased to prepare before you today to discuss the competition trends in VA's procurement, VA's enforcement of organizational conflict of interest regulations, and the department's use of professional and management consulting services contracts. Joining me today, as you stated, Mr. Chairman, are my colleagues, Mr. Phil Christie, Deputy Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction, Dr. Angela Billups, our Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition and Logistics, and also the VA's Senior Procurement Executive, Ms. LaWanda Jones, our Deputy Chief Information Officer for Strategic Sourcing from the Office of Information and Technology, and Mr. Joseph Maletta, Executive Director for Acquisitions from the Veterans Health Administration. As the committee is aware, VA's procurements of goods and services has grown from $20 billion in fiscal year 2012 to over $56 billion in 22, which is a 177% increase over the 10-year period. This increase represents a significant rise in procurement workload and the need to efficiently and smartly execute all the contracting requirements that support VA's mission needs. Even with this increase, VA has always placed great importance on adhering to all laws and regulations and maintaining the trust of veterans and taxpayers in the proper execution of the procurement of all goods and services that support our mission. To deal with the major increase in procurement activities over the last 10 years, VA has established a formal category management program to support the smart and efficient execution of how we buy goods and services. This program is consistent with the Office of Management and Budget, OMB Memoranda M19-13, Category Management, making smarter use of common contract solutions and practices. It's important to note that category management has not resulted in the loss of competition nor hindered VA's enforcement of organizational conflict of interest regulations. In fact, we've demonstrated exceptional results in the last 5 years, and our competition rates as of July 10th are currently achieving a 97% competition rate for all procurements to date. Also in FY22, VA achieved a 90% spend under management, exceeding the OMB goal of 87%. VA aggressively promotes the use of fair competition and opportunities among all prospective vendors for VA awards. We use a variety of contracting vehicles to meet the department's needs to ensure competition and deliver results that save taxpayer dollars while providing world-class health care and benefits to our veterans. However, the use of these contracts are not prioritized at the expense of our agency's Veterans First contracting program, nor our small business goals. VA's procurement processes include risk management controls to ensure compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and VA policy. We are further strengthening our acquisition maturity and oversight by rolling out our new Acquisition Lifecycle Framework, commonly known as ALF, which complements our improved governance structure. Because VA's large annual spend on contracts, it's not uncommon for a vendor to be selected for several different requirements. But the department follows Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR, and the appropriate law. It should be noted that contractors are selected based upon their competency and ability to successfully respond to the solicitation requirements. Many companies have multiple areas of expertise and compete on requirements for different services throughout the enterprise. VA takes the concern of organizational conflict of interest very seriously, as do I personally, and we ensure its contract awards comply with the FAR, the VA Acquisition Regulation, as well as the VA Acquisition Manual. In the last 12 months, VA has received 3 major OCI complaints by industry, which were independently investigated by the Government Accountability Office, GAO, who also determined that those OCIs did not exist and that VA did indeed follow the proper procedures in the determination process. VA does have one current high visibility OCI allegation, which is still under investigation, and will follow the established procedures to make a final determination once that investigation is complete. Regarding the use of professional management and consulting services, VA is carefully monitoring this category of spend for work conducted by contractors, while also looking for duplication of efforts as part of our category management program. VA is committed to addressing organizational conflicts of interest and finding ways of limiting the amount of taxpayer dollars being spent on government on professional services contracting to ensure they are only doing what the department truly needs. While we in VA are following the FAR and continue to remain in compliance with the law, there's more that we can do. And as CAO, I place this upon one of my top priorities and am adding additional policies and reviews where appropriate, to ensure we are doing everything we can to ensure full and fair competition for all potential vendors to have an equal opportunity for government contracts. For example, we are incorporating a truly independent validation and verification contract to strengthen our oversight. We just rolled out a draft RFP, request for proposal, on Tuesday to get industry's input to make sure that we're planning on initiating the IVV for our major acquisition programs by the end of the year, which is in line with the draft legislation that you're proposing. This will enable true independent and agnostic oversight to validate and provide confidence that we have asked the contractor to do what asked them to do was properly delivered on time and on budget. Chairman Rosendale, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Surplus McCormick, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. My colleagues and I are pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Parrish. We will now proceed to questioning, and I would like to recognize Chairwoman Kiggins for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Parrish, do you stand by the Secretary's May 31st response to my letter stating that no potential or actual organizational conflicts of interest existed in any advisory and assistance contracts in 2021 or 2022, or would you like to amend that response?
I stand by that statement to the best of my knowledge, ma'am.
My understanding is the VA contracting officers who ultimately report to you are relying on the contractor certifications that they do not have any conflicts of interest. Is that correct?
That is one in the step of the process of a contract solicitation, correct.
So, Mr. Parrish, have you instructed the contracting officers to do anything further, like identify the other work a contractor is performing or the business relationships a company has, or consider whether the representation seems to be true?
Let me pass that off to Dr. Billups, who can answer some of the processes that we have inside the VA. Dr. Billups.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. What we actually do at the VA, we actually follow the requirements in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. In the Federal Acquisition Regulation, it actually lists a requirement for those contractors to certify that any potential conflicts of interest. And in addition to them identifying that, those contracting officers take that information that's in the proposal and they look at that to determine whether or not the information that was provided by that potential offerer, if there is additional information that needs to be considered, or if there's something there that would trigger them to make a different decision, the contracting officer. And so they follow the procedures that are there. Last year, well, let me step back. 2021, we actually looked at the personal conflicts of interest and we updated that area for standardized guidance throughout the VA, working with the Office of General Counsel, actually updated some training and ethics for the politicals that were coming into VA. And one of the other things that we did in 2022 is updated the area in the VA supplement to the FAR as it relates to OCIs, as well as our internal procedures, guidance, and instructions called a VA acquisition manual. So all of these things, excuse me, are what the contracting officers and the HCAs are using before they award these contracts. And all of these things should be at least that first step toward looking at whether or not there is an issue that needs to be considered around this area of conflicts of interest.
So, and as a follow-up to that, Dr. Billups, so we're pretty much taking the contractor's word for it that they're operating above board under the letter and spirit of the conflict of interest regulations. Is that good enough? Do you believe that's adequate?
That is what's required by the regulation from the standpoint of the certification. And of course, in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, there are also remedies if we find later on that a contractor has certified that there are no organizational conflicts of interest. If we find something out later on, we have remedies that are already in the FAR. We can use the suspension and debarment as well as other remedies. But in addition to that, if it's something that we find out, we also can create mitigation plans for those OCIs when they do come to our attention. But from the letter that you sent to the Secretary in March, working with those heads of those contracting activities who all of the contracting officers report to, the information that came back was that there were none that align with the request that you had in your letter.
So also as a follow-up, how many times do you have to do the mitigation response where a conflict is identified and you actually have to take some action like mitigation response? I've been at VA now for almost 4 years, and there has none of those have come to my attention. I'm not sure if there has been any for MSPV or other areas, so if someone else has some input to that.
Good morning. I just want to add two things. Obviously, everything that Dr. Bellops has said correct. With the letter and meeting with your staff, after we met, one of the things that we went back to as part of category management, we are required to submit formalized plans to OMB. Part of that plan is identifying duplication, i.e. contracts with the same contractors. We were going to start using that information to share with the contracting offices saying, hey, this Company A has 200 contracts with the VA. We need to look at that and see if there's possible overlap. So everything that Dr. Bellops talked about certificate, absolutely true. We are going to start taking more steps and then using the information from our category management plans to help the contracting field, the contracting officers that may not have that total visibility, give them those lists and say, hey, these contractors have multiple contracts throughout the VA. Is there overlap? I will share with you, a lot of times, especially, we have about 3,000 contracting officers in the VA, about 2,400 of them are out in the field, and they don't always see everything, what everyone's buying on your left and right. We're gonna try to strengthen that to capture that. And that's why we're not seeing in the system, and by the way, the system at the moment doesn't have a way for us to say, hey, was there an OCI here, to kind of trigger through the system. A lot of this is through a manual data call that requires us, no kidding, to flip through pages to see was there an OCI, is there a mitigation there. We're not able to run an electronic report or have visibility at that level. These are things, obviously, since the letter we've talked about and are going to start looking at that capability to attack this problem.
Do you know what the timeline will be then for when you'll start, because you're not currently doing
So
it.
the category management plans, obviously the information from there, those are pretty much wrapped up for 24. The information in them will be distributed probably within the next week or two to highlight folks like, hey, we have these many contracts with company XYZ, and make sure that we start to get that out there. Part of the category management team is also going to be looking at going, hey, these 200, I'm just using fictional numbers here, these contracts with this particular company, let's see how similar they are, and are they in similar mission sets? So you could have one in VHA, you could have one in VBA, but if we have some that look like there's overlaps there, we're going to start to trigger that and say, okay, hey, let's reach out to the contracting officer. Are you aware that we have one here and here, looks similar? We need to take a peek at it to make sure that the contracting officer has that knowledge to make a determination about the OCI.
Yeah, I would love to hear a report of what that looks like once you implement it and how many conflicts you find and any you're working out, or if you're ending the contract, or just kind of what the outcome of that action will be. But thank you for taking that outcome or that approach. Mr. Parrish, if I could ask one other, I'm sorry, I'm very over, okay. I'll save it
Thank
for
you,
later.
Chairwoman Higgins.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
that.
much.
I now recognize Ranking Member Surfalis McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As is common now in federal contracting, smaller companies are acquired by larger government contractors, which leads to decreased competition and conflict of interest. There's certainly been the case from our observation of the T4NG contracting vehicle which is used by the VA and administered by the Technology Acquisition Center. GAO's testimony from our last hearing and recent reports highlighted that as dollar amounts have increased for IT contracting at VA, that the number of recipients of the awards have decreased. Mrs. Jones, from your observation, has the Technology Acquisition Center done a sufficient job to manage the number of companies that were on the T4NG vehicle?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. We have definitely oversight of the T4NG vehicle. And I just want to highlight from an IT perspective, every acquisition that is awarded goes through the Federal IT Acquisition Reform Act, known as FTARA. And so we are looking at those particular, the CIO is responsible for all acquisition strategies and acquisition plans. And additionally, before anything is awarded on T4 or GSA vehicle or SOUP vehicle, we conduct extensive market research. So we feel that we are managing and are overseeing that contract appropriately.
Realizing that the new version of T4NG is currently being protested, we don't know which contractors will be eligible. What has VA proactively done to ensure that you're not limiting the pool of competition?
First of all, we continue to conduct market research, and I want to highlight the T4, and especially from a service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses and VOSBs. That T4 contract is, to our knowledge, the only contract in the federal government that part of the acquisition evaluation is veterans employment. And so from the time T4 was initiated in 2016, those vendors hired 16,000 veterans. Today, there are 58,000 veterans hired by those vendors on the T4 contract.
So you haven't done anything proactively, is that what you're saying?
I think we've done a lot proactively to make sure that every acquisition that we do is competed competitively.
So in these circumstances, could you list what you've done? What proactive steps have you done to make sure that you're not limiting the pool? Just need those steps.
So, and I will turn that over to Mr. Christie.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick. So before the solicitation went out, there were 3 industry days where we had an opportunity for all of industry. So this went out through SAM.gov, a worldwide announcement. Hey, this isn't a requirement that's coming out. We want people to be interested. Here's what it means. And so we had multiple industry days, both virtually and in place, to talk about what that was and to explain what the requirement was and just try to generate interest into this. So, if you will, it wasn't just the same folks from the current T4NG, but trying to attract new folks to that. The new T4NG, obviously, at the moment, we're targeting 15 will be veteran-owned companies that will be on that contract. That is the target for that. The rest will play out depending on who has the best there. But the key there is to generate the interest and the newness of the folks applying for that. Also, some different things that we've promoted on there is the joint ventures and other teaming arrangements. So not only just kind of just a standalone company, but folks might be able to come together and propose on this and act as a joint venture to have opportunity for them.
And how are you measuring the success of what you're imposing now?
So at the end of the day, it'll be a successful award of the contract vehicle. And we are targeting 30 awards for the new T4NG.
Well, the success of recruitment and making sure everybody's aware of the opportunities, how are you, the proactive steps that you just described, how are you measuring? What are the variables to say this is a success or we should amplify or move forward?
Yeah, so this is where we get in a little polarity management, where we do want new people on the contract, but the reality is we put out the rules for how you will be decided if you win the contract. And so for whoever wins, wins. It's based on meritocracy, right? If you had the best solution, you bring the best value, you could win. That could mean a lot of the existing contractors. But that's why we were trying to, again, with those industry days and creating the communications before the solicitation went out, is to try to reach folks that maybe not be aware of it, and or, hey, there might be other ways that you could team together to look at this to get on the contract.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Surface McCormick. I now recognize General Bergman for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes we learn from historical examples. Sometimes we don't. Does the name Fat Leonard ring any bells with any of you? Yeah, probably the biggest bribery scandal in at least modern Navy history. I will say that was an example of how not to. So let's just, Mr. Parrish, many of the crimes committed by contractors against VA and other healthcare agencies involve bribery, kickbacks. I want to read to you just a couple of examples from the Inspector General. A Boston area spinal device company was charged for paying surgeons between $32,000 and $978,000 in bribes. A Florida lab owner was charged for perpetrating a $53 million fraud and kickback scheme related to genetic cancer screening. A doctor licensed in Texas and Oklahoma allegedly accepted kickbacks in return for writing prescriptions for certain compounded drugs. Mr. Parrish, do you have any procedures in place to detect suspicious ordering patterns, unusual changes to contracts, or other activities that may indicate criminality?
Let me pass that off to, I think either Dr. Phillips or Mr. Chris Seward will take that for action to get answers back.
Thank you, sir, for the question. Some of the things that, is there something in place today? The answer is no. One of the things that we're planning on doing is looking.
Can I ask just a question? If this is not new, why? If you're planning on doing something, how long do we have to wait before there are, if you will, triggers in place that would detect activity? So what are we waiting for?
We're really not waiting on anything. It is something that we have been talking about internally.
Do we have a timeline? Do we have a plan of action and milestones, or we can say 6 months from now, a year from now? What are we thinking here?
Congressman Bergman, I think to get to the gist of your question is we're implementing independent verification validation procedures, which will help and go towards assisting checking on contracts and focusing on the large contracts initially, and we hope to have that in place by the end of the fiscal year. We've started that by, as I mentioned, having a draft.
Well, the bottom line, this committee, we appreciate all you do, but we are required, as members of Congress, to hold to timelines. And I'm curious. I mean, if I'm the Fat Leonard of the guy working inside the VA system to do what I'm doing nefariously and illegally, then I know that I can just keep on doing it because there aren't anything in place yet. I'm a little concerned with that. But I'd like to go down a different way here. Ms. Jones, as VA CIO, Mr. Del Bene committed to recuse himself from being directly involved in any VA procurement decisions of importance to his former employer, Microsoft. Yet since his appointment, the VA awarded Microsoft $1.6 billion, a licensing agreement contract on April the 1st of 2022. Was Mr. Del Bene involved in the decision?
Thank you for that question, sir. The answer is absolutely, positively no.
Okay. Do you feel any pressure
I feel
to
absolutely no.
give Microsoft extra business?
I would say we're not giving Microsoft extra business.
No, that's not what I asked you. I said, do you feel any pressure?
I feel no pressure.
Okay, so Ms. Jones, what is your policy to ensure that a broad range of companies can compete for business in their areas of unique expertise? For example, video conferencing and cybersecurity, moving forward, given Microsoft's ability to bundle, because having been in the private sector, working for small companies, working for large companies, I know a little bit from personal experience how things can work. Is there any should we be concerned as the committee that there is a threat to good competition because of the reason for making the decision is, well, it's easier to bundle. We can do with one vendor as opposed to several.
The government does not determine, sir, when industry bundle their products. And the Microsoft contract that we currently have in place was awarded prior to the CIO's appointment. Secondly, for every acquisition that we have, again, we look at the market research to determine, but we also
I appreciate it. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, General Bergman. We are going to recess now for votes. I'm sure you all have been tracking as I have, and we expect to resume at approximately 10:50, but it will be 15 minutes after the last vote. We are beginning again. Thank you for your patience. The country appreciates it. I would now like to recognize Mr. Mervan for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. I've introduced legislation to create an acquisition review board at the VA this Congress, and testimony last week, the VA was supportive of this legislation. I'm happy to continue working with the VA on providing structure and solutions to ensure that the award and the management of large contracts ensures that we are making the best use of taxpayer funds and provide better health care and benefits to veterans. Dr. Billups, I appreciate your testimony and participation in our hearing last week, and would like to give you an opportunity to discuss how this legislation will help VA with issues relating to conflicts of interest and competition.
Thank you, sir, for the question. This particular legislation will really help from the standpoint that this gets back to the heart of just starting to look at a program from the aspect of that executive that's in charge of that particular mission area. As that executive in charge of that particular mission area, they have to put together the business case to support whether or not VA will actually be approving for the program to move forward. But as it relates to competition and OCI, this is also an area that they can start looking at also, because they're the ones who know the different contracts that across their portfolio that may be using similar contracts, or the executives, their peers in VBA, VHA, as well as NCA. So some of the things that we can work on is helping them to understand how important some of these areas are as it relates to competition. What is that current landscape as it relates to the contractors that are doing business with VA, how those contractors, and there may be that potential of an organizational conflict of interest, and we're working all of these things together from the beginning and the outset of that executive that's in charge, and then moving that into the acquisition lifecycle where the acquisition workforce can provide that support, as well as the CIO, the CHICO, the Human Capital Chief, as well as the CAO, and finance, and all of that kind of working together. That is the way that this acquisition review board can really help us to make some improvements in all of these areas.
Okay. And my follow-up is, Dr. Billups, once we are able to move this legislation forward and codify this board, what in the future should we be focusing on as it pertains to providing you with tools and resources you need to effectively manage acquisitions and guard against conflicts of interest?
We already, at the present time, have a plan for improving acquisition management from an end-to-end perspective at the VA. The GAO came out, and I think you mentioned GAO, acquisition management was on the GAO high-risk list as of 2019. We actually done something that, from what was shared with us from the Comptroller General, is that VA got its acquisition plan, its action plan to address those areas of concern in the GAO high-risk list in a matter of 3 years. It has never been done before, according to the Comptroller General. So what we're doing now, we're moving from a plan to some strategies and some action. But I can tell you, we do have some gaps as it relates to resources to really fully implement all of the things that we have planned to do. And that's one of the reasons why we put a ticket in for the ARB for $25 million in 2024, but we will need additional resources as we flesh out the activities that are in the plan. And in FY23, we have started working through all of those activities that are in that plan, and we have already identified areas where we need additional resources.
Thank you. Mr. Parrish, I wanted to give you an opportunity to be able to talk about acquisition maturity and the level that you're taking that to.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Congressman Mervan. I guess what I want to highlight here is when I first took over this role back in March of 2021, there was a belief that acquisition in VA was focused on individual administrations and kind of a focus on contracts only. And as Dr. Billups said, we've grown exponentially over the last couple of years to focus on life cycle management. So acquisitions, we say big A acquisition, and it starts from cradle to grave. And we've implemented a lot of different policies and processes. And one of the biggest impacts under the guidance and leadership of Secretary McDonough is around the jointness and transparency. And it's really working collaboratively across the enterprise, working with all the entities, VHA, VBA, NCA, and focusing on understanding the business need from the very beginning, getting the requirements established correctly, and understanding what success looks like, and have those metrics established before we ever start any major program. And it really gets to the heart of really focusing on a systematic approach to be able to do some of these deployments of long-term major complex systems and trying to fix some of these efforts. So more work to do, but I'm very proud of being part of this team. And as I say, Cadet borrow from someone, we say acquisition is a team sport in VA now. And I think everybody is moving forward in the right direction. We work really closely with the CIO, the CFO, and other teammates across the enterprise.
Thank you, Mr. Parrish. Mr. Chairman, with that, and I had a private moment with you where I want to compliment him. Besides his tough exterior, I hope you all noticed his Ken dress like for Ken and Barbie today. We should all make sure that he made that effort in support of the movie that's coming
Thank you.
out. So, Chairman Chairman
Ken was
Rosendale.
I understand Ken was getting a bad rap, so I just thought I would.
I
stand
noticed
up
it
a
right away, sir.
Thank you.
And Montanans will love that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. I now recognize Representative Radewagen for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Parrish. Do you believe it may create an organizational conflict of interest when a company staffs a senior executive or political appointee's office and at the same time holds contracts to perform projects for that office?
I believe, if you can reword the question, ma'am?
There is no other way to. Do you believe it can cause an organizational conflict of interest when a company staffs a senior executive or political appointee's office and at the same time holds contracts to perform projects for that office?
So you're asking, if I understand the question, you're asking if a vendor or a contractor has one of their executives inside, like a VA organization or a government organization? Is that?
I think that's what I'm asking, yes.
Yes, ma'am. I think it depends, and it's based upon the FAR requirements. We do have a requirement that if they're doing program management support, they're not allowed to do, or they're not allowed to participate in a solicitation for a program in that area. And that's part of the FAR and part of our VA acquisition regulations as well. So it's possible to be the right answer. It depends.
So as a follow-up, Ms. Jones, is it accurate that some of the companies that support or have supported the OIT front office also provide software or develop systems for VA?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. I am not aware of that, and I can take that for the record.
How do you monitor or restrict the information, Ms. Jones, those contractors are privy to in the course of facilitating meetings, managing calendars, preparing briefing materials, or other support functions?
Can you repeat the question, please?
How do you monitor or restrict the information those contractors are privy to in the course of facilitating meetings, managing calendars, preparing briefing materials, or other support functions?
So first and foremost, and I want to speak particularly about the acquisition meetings. We do not have contractors in those meetings. I'm personally responsible for the Federal IT Acquisition Reform Act, of which the CIO is responsible for reviewing all IT acquisitions and acquisition plans. We do not have any contracts in those meetings, so they are totally restricted from that.
Okay, so back to Mr. Parrish. What functions do contractors perform in your organization, either on-site in VA offices or remotely? And as a follow-up, how do you monitor and restrict those contractors' activities or access to information?
So I do know that we have, and I can let my teammates here discuss what certain small business vendors do for them. We do have some program management support offers that work and help with some of the analysis of some of the work we do. However, I'll reiterate that for those that are doing that area, they are not bidding on contracts that they otherwise would be helping us to facilitate. And I don't know if Phil or Angela, you want to add on some of your contractors you're working on?
Yeah, one thing that I think all of us maybe didn't get out is in those types of situations, you mentioned access to calendars or maybe shared drives, things of that nature, information that the VA uses to operate. Those type of support contractors do have to support non-disclosure agreements.
Okay, so Mr. Parrish, let's take today's hearing. What involvement did contractors have in preparing for today's hearing?
With me, none.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Radewagen. As we've discussed, the thing that we're trying to address here is conflict, but not only the conflicts, the actual conflicts, but the perception of conflicts. And Mr. Parrish, you laid out very clearly that increased transparency is the best way for us to achieve that. Daylight is the best disinfectant, as they say. Ms. Jones, I understand you're responsible for engaging with IT vendors about contracting opportunities and maintaining relations with existing contractors. Can you explain exactly what that entails?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for that question. My IT vendor management office is responsible for contractors who are either doing business with us or want to do business. And what we do is we bring them in and we talk about their capabilities from a market research perspective. One of the things that we say upfront and early in any discussion is, one, we do not talk about ongoing solicitation, and two, I cannot and will not, I cannot guarantee you any contract because it has to go through the procurement process. But we actually use that information for market research.
Okay, and do other OIT employees also engage with IT vendors?
The answer is yes. However, we highly recommend that they use my IT vendor management office to schedule those meetings. Therefore, we keep some consistency going on and we make sure that we don't talk about those things that I just said.
And how do you actually outline and enforce what they are permitted to do and what they are not to do?
First of all, we give them training. Secondly, I personally attend most of the vendor session meetings. If I don't, one of my other executives do, or my vendor management director attends those meetings. So to the best of our ability, we put controls in place.
Okay, and Ms. Jones, how do the other OIT senior leaders engage with IT vendors, either with you or independent of you?
So they definitely, thank you, sir, they definitely engage with me because as vendors are coming in, one of the first things that we ask for is what are your capabilities? Because I want to make sure and we want to make sure that if you're providing a capability, then we have the right OIT stakeholders in the session to hear those capabilities.
Are there any times that an OIT employee would engage with a vendor by themselves?
To the best, well, first of all, to the best of my knowledge, I am not there to police every OIT employee, so I cannot definitively say
So
yes
let me
or
ask you, is
no.
all of the scheduling, 100% of that, do you have access to that?
I have access to the scheduling that my office schedules because it's from my calendar.
Okay. Ms. Jones, how does Assistant Secretary Del Benny specifically engage with IT vendors?
So first of all, I'm the one that schedules the sessions that he's going to have with any vendor.
Okay, so specifically, are those appointments, you're scheduling those, then what other staff participates? Do we always have additional staff in there?
Absolutely, and it depends upon the capability that the vendor is coming in to talk about. So our goal is to make sure that we have the right OIT stakeholder there.
And Microsoft is a very significant VA contractor. How many times in the last 2 years have you met with Microsoft, and roughly how many times have other OIT officials met with Microsoft?
Thank you. That question I would have to take for the record because I'm not counting, or I don't have a count in my head how many times every OIT vendor has met with Microsoft.
Okay, we would like to have that. I mean, could you make an estimate? 5 times, 10 times, 25 times?
No, sir, I will not make an estimate,
Okay.
but I will take it back for the record, and we will look at the calendar. And as you know, Microsoft is a contractor that was there prior to our CIO.
So we should be able to, if you can just look at the calendar, we should be able to get that sometime next week then, provide that information?
I would do my best to get it to you, sir, absolutely.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, to the best of your knowledge, how many times in the last 18 months has Assistant Secretary Del Benny met with Microsoft?
Absolutely zero to my knowledge. To my knowledge, zero.
Okay, I would appreciate if you would also check in with him as you're checking the calendar so we can get an accurate description of that, as he's not here for me to ask.
Yes, sir. If I may, when it comes to the Assistant Secretary and Microsoft, it is my responsibility to make sure that he does not meet with them, and I'm pretty adamant about that.
Okay, Ms. Jones' committee staff met with Assistant Secretary Del Benny on April the 27th. During that meeting, we learned that there is no formal process to document when Mr. Del Benny recuses himself from Microsoft-related matters. No official process. The Office of General Counsel Attorney present agreed that it would be a very good idea to start keeping a record of Mr. Del Benny and other VA executives' recusals when they actually recuse. On May 10th, Chairman Boss sent a letter asking for a summary of VA's plan to document these recusals. VA never answered. So the chairman followed up on June the 5th with another letter. There still has been no answer. I would love to give you folks the benefit of the doubt, but right now, you have no way of proving why Mr. Del Benny has ever recused himself. The fact that you haven't responded to the two letters that simply ask for a plan to start documenting the recusals does not inspire confidence in me or this committee. We need a response to that. When will the VA respond?
Thank you, sir. I am a veteran myself, and I do
Thank you
take
for
my
your
job
service.
extremely seriously. And I will personally go back and I will work with our office and with the Office of OCLA to see when we can get you that response.
As we get the information next week, I'm assuming for the calendar, if you could give us a response next week on when this other information be forthcoming, it would be greatly appreciated.
Absolutely, sir.
Thank you so much. With that, we're going to start the second round of questioning and go to Chairwoman Kiggins. 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Parrish, the Secretary's May 31st letter wasn't concerned about any conflicts of interest at McKinsey and its clients. When did anyone at the VA first become aware that McKinsey also had opioid manufacturer clients and was advising them on how to sell more pain pills to the VA and other healthcare organizations?
Congresswoman Kiggins, we'll take that for a record, and I'll have to get you a better answer back. I'm not aware.
Okay. Along those same lines, do you know did McKinsey ever certify in its contract proposals that it had any potential organizational conflicts of interest related to the opioid manufacturer clients or any other situations?
I'll take that for action also, and get an answer back for you, ma'am.
And that was kind of the premise of my letter also. And then, Mr. Parrish, when someone did become aware of this, what was done to assess the situation and determine whether it posed a problem?
Without getting into details, I do know that we're continuing to look at that, and I mentioned that there are certain investigations ongoing, so once we have that resolved, we'll be able to give you a better answer on that.
Okay, yep, please do. I'd be curious. And now I'd like to list some inherently governmental functions that contractors can support but are prohibited from performing. These come directly from the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and I assume the panel is familiar with them. There's reorganizations and planning, developing policy, developing regulations, developing requirement and contracting documents. So the VA has multiple contractors working in each of these areas today. How are these contractors monitored, and is there anything in place to make sure they don't cross the line and start making decisions for the VA?
I'll defer that to some of our colleagues who actually have those working with them. Joe, if you want to give an example. I do know that one of the rules that we have, as I mentioned earlier, ma'am, is that if they're doing internal work on our support program management, they are not allowed to be able to bid on any kind of efforts that they might be helping or assisting with. But I'll pass it to Joe.
Okay. For awareness, my responsibilities for the Veteran Health Administration Procurement Organization alone for our administration in support of our acquisition community, my office, we do not have any contractor support with the exception of some contracting staff that actually do non-inherently governmental functions to support and help us execute the administrative part of contract administration, such as preparing documents for closeouts, et cetera. We do not have any other contractor staff that help us with acquisition plans, et cetera.
Does anyone else?
Also, just like you said, in the federal acquisition regulation, as it relates to inherently governmental, each one of those contracting officers also have a responsibility to work with their program offices to make sure that that determination has been made for each of those requirements. And that is a requirement that's in the FAR. They have to list that information. They have to have documentation in the file that they have had those conversations. And that is a requirement, like I said, that's in the federal acquisition regulation.
Also pass to Ms. Jones.
Yes, ma'am. We do not have any, to the best of my knowledge, contractors doing anything that's inherently governmental functions. We do have technical management services contractors, and they are working on, for example, some architectural designs of our programs. They are also doing configuration management. They may be doing some testing, but they are working for our government program managers or our portfolio managers.
And if I could just finalize that, ma'am, is for all of contracts, and it's still a work in progress, all of our contracts, we expect any support contract, services or otherwise, to have clear deliverables and expect them to deliver what they promise on time and on budget.
Thank you, and I look forward to following up with you guys hopefully next year and hearing how some of the changes you're putting in place are gonna improve the system. But thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman McKiggins. I will now recognize Ranker Mervan for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, how long have you been the CIO?
I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't hear you.
How long have you been in your position?
I've been in the department for 12 years. I've been in this current position since 2018.
Okay, since 2018, has Microsoft been awarded a contract?
We
Or
have,
let me rephrase the question. For how long has the VA utilized Microsoft?
so from a federal government perspective, as you know, all of us use Teams, all of us use MS Word, so Microsoft is, that infrastructure has been in our department, at least since I've been there. And I would say if you look from a federal government perspective, if we are all using Word, we're using Microsoft. If we're all using Teams, we're using Microsoft.
Okay, so do you have the information with you on what the spend was for the VA through your oversight for 18, 19, and 20?
I don't have it with me, but I can get it, sir. I can take that for the record.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Parrish, we have heard from a large number of service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses that they are concerned that these large companies are putting them out of business. There are complaints of high fees being charged by distributors and a lack of use of the blanket purchase agreements that veterans' small businesses are awarded. What are you doing to ensure that the next version of the MSPV contracts, that these large companies are not able to sell their supplies in place of the veterans' small businesses?
So I'll defer to Mr. Millett first, and then I'll have another additional response on a macro scale. Joe?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I think it's most important to note that the upcoming MedSurg Prime Vendor contract will have accountability for the prime vendors to utilize the blanket purchasing agreements that have been established by the folks in my office, of which greater than 50% of them are small business concerns. That accountability will help us to determine whether or not there's any gamesmanship or malfeasance going on if a prime vendor is not utilizing the vendors we've assigned to them to utilize. So that has been in response to our similar concerns as to what you just expressed.
If I could just highlight, we acknowledge that the amount of small businesses getting contracts government-wide has been significantly reduced over the last 10 years. And I think there's some concerns around consolidation of industry where small businesses are being acquired by the larges, and that's one area. But I think the other area is we've created a unintentional bias against small businesses to be able to bid on some of our contracts, especially in the IT space. For example, as the cloud services are exponentially growing in technology, the FedRAMP rules, which are absolutely required to make sure that we have proper cybersecurity oversight. It takes years to get FedRAMP certified, and it takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to get FedRAMP certified. In fact, the FedRAMP, Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, has been around since 2011, and only 300 cloud offerings have been certified. And that basically limits who can then bid on our new contracts that we're putting out that are cloud-based and cloud service. So we have to find a way government-wide to improve some of these regulatory requirements to help small businesses.
With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking-Member Van. Mr. Parrish, the attitude of the VA toward documenting ethical matters seems to be extremely hands-off. There seems to be no process whatsoever to track organizational conflicts of interest or recusals. You and the other panelists have assured us that everything is fine, but you have very little to show us to demonstrate that it's true. You can't provide transparency if we don't have any documentation or record to look into. I mean, I've got a very old saying that has been helpful to me in my business. Inspect what you expect. And if you don't have any documentation or record, then you're not going to be able to provide that transparency. You have no way to measure. You have no way to check. Do you believe that you personally and the Department of Veterans Affairs as an organization need to do better? And what specifically can you do, are you willing to do, to provide this transparency, this documentation?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Rosendale, and you have my commitment that we will do better and make sure that we have proper documentation based upon your earlier comments, and I will follow back up with you and your staff.
So again, we need to see some processes, okay, that you're going to be following. Mr. Parrish, if a company holds contracts in competing areas such as Vista and Cerner or the VA's internal scheduling project and commercial scheduling software, or maintaining the existing human resources systems and replacing it, do you believe that may give rise to a conflict of interest that requires further scrutiny?
To your earlier comment, Chairman, I believe there's potential for perception of conflict. One of the things I do want to reinforce of what we've been doing, I'll use the supply chain modernization effort as an example that the panel has talked about, is we're really focused on over-communicating and having large transparency and jointness with our vendors and our industry partners. So we talk to them quite a bit, industry days. We've had lots of draft RFPs. One of the requirements we do with these big programs is once we think we're ready, instead of just throwing it over the fence to industry, we make sure industry has input. And by shining sunlight on that, every vendor has the opportunity to see it. So there's not one vendor that gets an unfavorable advantage. And we have communications with companies all the time, and we offer up, if one company wants to come give us a discussion, we offer it up to everyone else to be able to have that same kind of discussion. And we always post any of the questions and answers that are posted out there, fully transparent on sam.gov, and you can use the supply chain modernization effort that's ongoing right now with the RFP on the street, that you can see that we've leveled the playing field from an e-library that has all of our internal workings and all our technology that everybody can see.
Okay, Mr. Parrish, do you consider it permissible for the same company to support a project and actually perform that project? For example, the electronic health record modernization or the human resources modernization.
If you're mentioning, Chairman, the program management office services, that's one of the rules that I mentioned earlier, that if someone's providing internal support to us, then they are not allowed to bid on that same support contract. So for supply chain, if they were doing supply chain admin work, they weren't allowed to bid on the supply chain solicitation.
Okay. And Mr. Parrish, how about if two companies merge and the combined entity is supporting and performing the project?
That does trigger a review, and that's where we have to go back and look at it inside the team with the contracting officer.
Okay. The VA is obviously not the Justice Department and can't impact a merger, but what would you do in that situation?
I'm not going to speculate, but I will take that for action, Chairman.
Okay. Again, this is something that we need to have the process laid out so that we can see, so we have some kind of consistency of the application.
Sir.
Okay, we've lost our ranking member. Representative Radewagen, do you have any additional questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no additional questions at this time, but I'm happy to yield my time to you.
Okay, I've got my questions all filled up. That was my last one, so it looks like we are in good shape. Where's my closing? Here we go. Okay, thank you again for all the witnesses this morning. As our time has concluded, I will dispense the closing remarks, but I want to assure everyone the committee will be continuing to monitor these issues, which are so important to the integrity of the Department of Veterans Affairs. With that, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered, and this hearing is adjourned.